Alara lived a life measured in silence. For 20 years, her world had been the four walls of her cabin and the vast, whispering forest that surrounded it. Her husband was a memory, a faded photograph on the mantelpiece, and her children were distant voices on a phone line once a month. She had chosen this quiet, this isolation, and found a rhythm in the solitude that suited the slow beat of her 70-year-old heart. Her days were simple. She tended her small garden in the brief summer. She split wood for the long, cold winter. She read the same books over and over, their stories as familiar as the grain of the wood on her table. The forest was her neighbor, a constant, living presence that breathed with the wind and slept under the snow. She knew its sounds: the chatter of squirrels, the cry of a hawk, the heavy tread of a moose in the undergrowth. She was a part of its silence, and it was a part of hers. But in the last few weeks, the silence had changed. It began with a feeling, a prickling on the back of her neck when she gathered wood near the creek, the undeniable sensation of being watched from the deep shadows of the pines. She told herself it was just an old woman's fancy, the mind playing tricks in the deep woods. Then came the sounds. They were not the familiar voices of the forest. Late at night, a sound would drift through the trees, a deep, resonant call that made the glass in her window pane hum. It was a sound of immense loneliness, a mournful question asked to the stars. She had never heard anything like it. It was not a bear. It was not a wolf. It was something else, something ancient. One morning, she found a track by the riverbank. It was huge, pressed deep into the mud, shaped like a man's foot, but impossibly large. She stared at it for a long time, her heart a cold stone in her chest. She smoothed it over with her boot, erasing the evidence. Some things, she thought, were better left unknown. She retreated to her cabin and bolted the door, a thing she had not done in years. The world outside her window grew more restless. Branches thicker than her arm were snapped cleanly, 12 feet from the ground. A heavy, musky scent, like damp earth and pine and something wilder, clung to the air after sunset. The feeling of being watched intensified. It was not malevolent. It felt curious, searching. But the fear remained, a low, persistent hum beneath the surface of her quiet life. Her predictable world was fraying at the edges. The storm arrived without warning, a furious assault of wind and rain that turned her small clearing into a churning sea of mud and chaos. The wind howled like a hungry animal, and the trees groaned under the strain. Alara sat by her fire, listening to the symphony of destruction outside. It was in the heart of this tempest that she heard the new sound. It was a cry, a high-pitched, frantic wail that was nearly lost in the roar of the wind. It was a sound of pure terror and pain, the sound of a child lost in the dark. It tore through the noise of the storm and went straight to her heart. Interspersed with the desperate cries was another sound, farther away, the deep, booming call she had heard before, but now it was filled with anguish. A parent, she realized. A parent searching for its child. Every instinct told her to stay inside, to feed the fire and ignore the world outside. The forest was not hers to tame. Its grief was not hers to mend. But the small, terrified cry came again, closer this time, and it was a sound she could not ignore. It was the sound of a baby, and a baby was a baby, no matter what shape it took. She lit an old oil lantern, its yellow light pushing back the shadows in her small cabin. She pulled on her heavy coat and boots, her hands trembling slightly. She did not know what she was going to do. She only knew she could not sit by the fire while a child suffered just outside her door. Curiosity had been replaced by a deep, aching compulsion to help. She unbolted the door and peered out into the churning darkness. The rain was a solid wall of water, and the wind tore at her clothes. She held the lantern high, its light cutting a small, flickering circle in the night. The crying was very close now, a series of terrified, gulping sobs. And then she saw it. Huddled against the log wall of her cabin, pressed into the small space beneath the overhang of the roof, was a creature. It was small, no bigger than a human toddler, and covered in a thick coat of dark, matted fur that was soaked through. It shivered violently, its small body trembling with cold and fear. It looked up as the light fell upon it. Its eyes were huge, dark, and filled with an intelligence that stunned her. They were not the eyes of an animal. They were the eyes of a person, a small person trapped in a strange, furry body. In that moment, all the stories, all the fears, all the impossible notions of monsters in the woods dissolved into a simple, undeniable truth. This was not a monster. This was a lost child, alone and terrified. Her fear vanished, replaced by a wave of compassion so powerful it took her breath away. The creature let out a low, whimpering sound and tried to press itself further into the wall, making itself smaller. She saw the raw terror in its face. Alara knew that going outside would only frighten it more. She took a step back, pulling the cabin door almost shut. Her mind raced. She thought of the woodshed attached to the side of the cabin. It was dry and sheltered. Its side door opened into the small clearing where the baby now shivered. She moved slowly, deliberately. She went to her old chest and pulled out a thick wool blanket, one her husband had used on the coldest nights. She went to the kitchen and poured some milk into a pan, warming it gently on the stove. She added a few spoonfuls of leftover beef stew, mashing the vegetables with a fork. It was food for a child. Simple. Warm. She walked to the interior door that led to the woodshed. It creaked as she opened it. The shed was dark and smelled of sawdust and pine. She crept to the outer door, the one that faced the storm. She cracked it open just enough to see the small, shivering form. It had not moved. It was watching her, its dark eyes wide in the gloom. She spoke, her voice barely a whisper, carried away by the wind. "It's okay." She kept her voice soft, a low murmur. "I will not hurt you." Slowly, she placed the bowl of warm milk and stew just inside the doorway of the shed. Then she laid the thick wool blanket beside it, a soft nest against the cold wood. She looked at the creature one last time. "It's for you," she whispered. Then she retreated, closing the woodshed's inner door and leaving the outer one propped open just a few inches. She returned to her chair by the fire and waited. For over an hour, there was nothing but the sound of the storm. Then, she heard a faint shuffling from the woodshed, a soft scrape of the bowl on the wooden floor, a series of soft, gulping sounds. The baby had come inside. Alara closed her eyes and let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. It was enough. The storm passed in the night. The next morning, the forest was clean and quiet, dripping with the remnants of the rain. Alara moved with cautious purpose. She found the bowl in the woodshed licked clean. The wool blanket was a messy heap in the corner, a small, warm depression in its center. The baby was gone. A pang of disappointment hit her, followed by a sense of relief. Perhaps it had found its mother in the night. But as she stood in her doorway, breathing the crisp morning air, she heard a soft cry from the woodshed. She peered inside. The baby was there, peeking at her from behind a stack of firewood. It was still afraid, but it had stayed. So began their strange routine. 3 times a day, Alara would bring food. Warm milk, soft fruits, cooked vegetables. She never tried to approach the baby. She would place the food down, whisper a few soft words, and retreat. She would spend hours sitting in her cabin, watching through a small crack in the door, sometimes humming old lullabies. The baby slowly grew bolder. It would come out from its hiding place to eat while she was still in the shed, watching her with its unervingly intelligent eyes. It was learning she was not a threat. In the distance, she could still hear the deep, calling cries of the parent, moving through the mountains, searching. It sounded farther away each day, and a cold dread grew in Alara's heart. What if the mother never found her child? On the 4th evening, the world changed again. Alara was placing the evening meal in the woodshed. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. As she stood up, a shadow fell over her. It was so large, so sudden, that it seemed to swallow the light. She froze. Her blood turned to ice. At the edge of the tree-line, no more than 50 feet away, stood the mother. She was immense, a towering figure of dark fur and powerful muscle, taller than any bear. Her arms were long and thick, and her head was framed by a heavy brow. She was a creature of myth, of nightmare, made real. She stood perfectly still, a silent, colossal statue against the dying light. Her eyes were fixed on Alara. They were the same intelligent, knowing eyes as her child's, but filled with a profound weariness and a fierce, protective power. This was the test. Alara knew it in her bones. One wrong move, one sign of fear or aggression, and it would all be over. Her life would end here, in the shadow of this impossible being. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she forced herself to remain calm. She did not scream. She did not run. She held the creature's gaze. Slowly, she raised her empty hands, palms forward, showing she held no weapon. She gave a single, slow nod towards the woodshed, a clear and simple gesture. Your child is here. Your child is safe. Then, with a slowness that felt like an eternity, she began to back away towards her cabin. She never turned her back. She never broke eye contact. The great creature did not move. It just watched her, its expression unreadable. Alara reached the door of her cabin, fumbled for the knob, and slipped inside, closing it softly behind her. She leaned against the door, her legs trembling, and slid to the floor, her body shaking with the aftermath of pure terror and awe. She had passed the test. Hours later, from her window, she saw the mother move. She did not approach the cabin. Instead, she settled at the edge of the clearing, a silent, patient guardian. A low, rumbling sound came from her deep chest, a sound of contentment, of reassurance directed at the small life hiding in the woodshed. It was not a growl. It was a purr, a sign of trust. The next morning, Alara walked out of her cabin to find the mother still there. She sat with a great, quiet dignity, watching her child stumble out of the woodshed. The baby looked stronger, healthier. It ran on clumsy legs to its mother, burying its face in her thick fur. The mother groomed her child with a gentle hand, her massive fingers surprisingly delicate. Alara brought the morning's food and placed it on a stump midway between the cabin and the treeling. The mother watched her every move. She did not seem threatening, only observant. The baby, now feeling safe in its mother's presence, took a piece of apple and chewed on it happily. Then, something happened that would forever be seared into Alara's memory. The mother looked directly at her. The gaze was deep and penetrating, a look that seemed to see right through her, to the core of her intentions. It was a look of ancient wisdom, of a life lived in a world hidden from human eyes. The mother slowly raised one of her massive hands. The gesture was so human, so deliberate, that it made Alara's breath catch in her throat. She placed the hand flat against her own broad chest, a gesture of the heart. Then, she dipped her great head in a slow, respectful bow. There was no mistaking the meaning. It was gratitude. It was respect. It was a profound and silent thank you for the kindness shown to her child. Tears welled in Alara's eyes. Without thinking, she mirrored the gesture, placing her own small, wrinkled hand over her heart. For a long moment, the two of them stood there, the small human and the giant of the forest, connected by a bond that needed no words. An understanding passed between them, a treaty of peace and mutual respect. They stayed for the rest of the day. The mother rested while the baby played, exploring the edge of the clearing but never straying too far. Alara watched them from her porch, feeling not like a captor, but like a host. An unlikely friendship had formed in this quiet corner of the world. As dusk began to settle, Alara knew it was time for them to leave. The air grew still. The mother stood, her incredible height seeming to brush the lowest branches of the ancient pines. She made a soft, clicking sound with her tongue, a signal to her child. The baby scampered to her side, clinging to the fur on her massive leg. The mother turned to leave, then paused. She looked back at Alara one last time. Her eyes held a deep, profound sadness, a melancholy that seemed to speak of ages of hiding, of being misunderstood. It was a look that acknowledged their connection, but also affirmed the gulf between their worlds. A final, silent farewell. Then she turned, and with her child beside her, she walked towards the forest. They did not crash through the undergrowth. They moved with an impossible grace and silence, their dark forms melting into the deepening shadows. One moment they were there, and the next they were gone, swallowed by the wilderness as if they had been nothing more than a dream. Alara stood on her porch until the last light had faded from the sky. The forest was silent again, but the silence was different now. It was heavier. It was an emptiness, a void left by the departure of something magnificent. Her small, quiet world suddenly felt immeasurably smaller. She went inside and sat by her fire, but found no comfort in its warmth. She was alone again, but her solitude was now tinged with a deep and abiding melancholy. She had been given a glimpse into a secret world, a world of deep emotions, of family, of a nobility that humbled her. She had looked into the eyes of the impossible and found not a monster, but a mother. She knew, with absolute certainty, that she could never speak of what she had seen. To tell the story would be a betrayal. It would bring disbelief, ridicule, or worse, it would bring men with guns and cameras and cages. It would destroy the sanctity of what had happened. This secret was hers to keep, a heavy and beautiful treasure she would carry for the rest of her days. The forest was never the same for her. Every snap of a twig made her look up, hopeful. Every distant, unknown call in the night made her listen, her heart aching with a strange sense of loss. Her life returned to its simple, quiet routine, but she was forever changed. She was no longer just a solitary old woman in the woods. She was a witness, a keeper of a sacred trust, and she understood that the deepest mysteries of the world were not meant to be solved, but simply to be honored.